told me that it was recording and probably give me information, which I never on this side when somebody else is actually organizing the Zoom. So that's kind of fun. I'm happy to talk about this. We have not too many people, so I'm totally open to having give or take. I've spent a lot of time on Zoom today, and I would like to hear voices. So if you have any questions, I will try to ask some questions along the way, so we can all pretend like we're in school again and get through to it. All right, I want to start here and from the beginning. Okay, so I've spent a ridiculous amount of time, it seemed like, for a long time living in East Africa. I first went to East Africa as a Peace Corps volunteer in the early mid-90s, I guess right smack dab in the middle of the 1990s. And then I went back in 2001 and lived in Tanzania while I worked on my dissertation research. And while I lived in Tanzania, I lived with Maasai. And this is a picture of our buddy Syria. Syria is this guy here. And they have one cow, and this is his sister, and she's milking the cow. She's milking the cow into this gourd. And Maasai eat milk every day. And one of the questions that I would ask people is, what did you eat today? And mostly because I'm just really curious about food. It wasn't necessarily, I mean, it was part of what I was thinking, asking questions about. I was interested in agriculture and cultivation and the conflict between cultivation and wildlife conservation, because we lived right in the side of a national park, and there would be, lions would go through at night, and wildebeest would walk through the village. So anyway, every day I would ask people what they had to eat, and many days it would just be milk, maybe milk and ugali. Ugali is this, somewhere between grits and polenta, and it's the staple food in East Africa. Good days, the best days, were just milk. Some days it was just milky tea. Some days it was milk and ugali. Milk, 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 and milk. And then some days you get really lucky and they would bleed a cow and there would be blood to have along with your milk. To keep people from getting grossed out, I'll take that back, take the picture of the blood off. I was telling some students about this picture today. I was convinced I was going to be able to drink some blood. I knew a Peace Corps volunteer who had, and he said it tasted like gravy, and he was full of vim and vigor afterwards. And I thought I could use some vim and vigor, and I like gravy, so I'm in. And then some small child ran up with a cup of sour milk, and the blood went into the sour milk, and it was too much for me, and I had to turn around and walk away, which made all the Maasai laugh at me that morning. But they don't bleed the cow too much, just a little bit, and then they basically bandage the cow up and let her stay inside the home area all day long. They don't send her to walk out. They make sure somebody brings her water, and they take care of her. Maasai really love their cattle. Maasai also eat a lot of roasted meat in the woods, and so here is a group of elders. This is my assistant over here on the side. The rest of them are all village elders, and there's been a birth in one of their families. And so the women they slaughter a sheep right in the front of the house, sometimes like literally in the doorway of the house. And then the men go out and either have a sheep or a goat in the woods. And all of this is supposed to be a part of making sure that there is enough food for the woman after she's given birth, to increase the amount of iron in her body. They are supposed to be taking the fat from the sheep, because sheep are really fatty animals, and making soup from it, so that because she's been trying not to eat very much while she was pregnant, in order to make sure that the baby was a little on the smaller side, because she was giving birth in a hut with no medicine associated with it. I really want to go back now that I've had children, so I could have these conversations again, because I think I would take a different point of view. One of the problems, though, that we were finding and people would complain about is that there was so little meat to be had per capita any longer. The milk amounts per capita were decreasing. The ugali amounts were increasing. And when they would slaughter, everybody would show up and want to have soup and want to have some roasted meat on the side. And the woman, the mother, would get less and less and less over time. And so she wasn't getting all the recuperation she needed. So food and sustainability as population increases has been changing and shifting. And these are really tightly wound with water quality and water access. And then simultaneously, I want to talk about this change, but also with the Sustainable Development Goals, or the global goals, that the UN has put forth as, or via lots of arguments, as a way to structure our planning and our thinking about the future, and making sure that we all have lives of dignity no matter where it is that we live. So I called this From Cattle to Three Stone Fires to Instant Pots, because I had to change the name after I gave it a basic name. We'll call it whatever. I want to talk about the global goals, food and water concerns, and then public climate change. The global goals are a group of 17 goals that the UN and a bunch of international organizations, USAID, Environmental Defense Fund, World Vision, all of these NGOs got together and argued them out for a very long period of time to come up with kind of 7 major topics that the world should be thinking about, no matter where you are, about how to survive in the future that we're aiming towards. And I actually had a former UNC student was working for the Environmental Defense Fund as they were developing these. And the one time I talked to her, and she's like, we're finally down to 35 goals. And the original set of goals had been 8. So she was like, we're finally down to 35 goals. And they ended up with the awkward 17 goals, of which several of them are really closely tied to water and to hunger. So we have no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, the water one, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry innovation and infrastructure, reduce inequalities, and then we kind of go into these big topic ones about sustainable cities and responsible consumption and climate change and life and water all over the place. And I'm curious, as you look at these, and this is a question that I ask in my classes, how do we link food and water to maybe all the top 6? Can you think of any ways? I don't know whether, can you throw one in the chat if you can think of a way that number 2 and number 6 could be related to one of the other 3 in that top row? And how? Through better education. I mean, definitely.
So just thinking about the ways that people approach different situations, thinking about, through better education, you open up doors and avenues to explore not just 1 or 2 different paths, but maybe 10 or 12 different paths. And all these different things allow you to then go in and talk to people and work with people and have a better understanding of, okay, if we go down this path, these are the long-term and even short-term impacts, versus if we go down this path and we try this, maybe we get more collaboration, we get more community buy-in, we have a better understanding of what we're doing, and then kind of things snowball in a positive direction that way.
Yeah, so education is totally critical in all of them. Can we link having clean water and sanitation to better water, to increasing education rates? I think Stacy's got it right there. Many girls don't go to school because there's no place for them once they start having periods. There's no place to handle it. The hygiene facilities are too limited. Many small children don't go to school because they have to carry the water that the teachers are going to need there, because sometimes the teachers in areas where they don't have access to water right on site, especially Well, a lot of places in East Africa, I believe, the teachers have to live on site because they aren't living where they were sent to go teach in an area that was really far away from their home site, from their home area. So they're living in a cube, in a room, essentially attached to a school. And they may or may not have enough water there. So children will carry water to them every day. And that just collecting that water takes a huge amount of time. Collecting the water that everybody needs every day takes a tremendous amount of time. How about food? This one is something that we think about here all the time, I would guess. If you don't have food on hand, then you're not going to be paying attention, which is why we have, free and reduced lunches, and free these days, at least here in Chapel Hill, they're free lunch, free breakfast. I'm guessing that's everywhere. So if you don't have access to to food and water, you don't have gender equality, you don't have quality educations, you don't have good health and well-being, obviously, and you're probably if you're in poverty, then you don't have access. So these are all interrelated questions, interrelated problems. The way they're set up is that each one has a specific series of targets underneath it. So for Zero Hunger, among their targets are to end hunger and ensure full access to sufficient food, to end malnutrition by 2025, to double the agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers, and to ensure sustainable food production, and to maintain genetic diversity of seeds, plants, and animals. And about all of those data points, all of those points on the side are things that I spend an entire week on, or 2 weeks on in a semester. So I would be happy to talk about any of them in any depth. But first I want to say is that we're not on track to reach this by 2030. So all the global goals, the goal is to hit their targets by 2030. We're not going to. Currently, there are 690 million hungry in the world, and by 2030, they're expecting that to increase to 840 million-ish, partly as a result of overall population growth to begin with, keeping those trajectories, but partly because the world's been kind of a dicey place in the last couple of years. The number of hungry had been holding steady, and it's started to increase in 2015. So we're moving backwards a little bit right here. I'm curious on why, you might guess, or the one maybe that I would like to really talk about here is this doubling of agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers. Firstly, we know that we can double agricultural productivity. This is something we've more than doubled agricultural productivity in the United States over the last 100 years. And we did most of that within like the 1960s. So a good chunk of that was in the 1960s. We know it can be done really rapidly. But small scale producers are really important to pay attention to. One of the ways that we did this in the United States was by consolidation and having larger farms. We have fewer and fewer people that are actually doing our farming, which most of us know at this point, because we had jobs for them to go to. We had things for people to do in the cities so they could get off the land. Along at the same time as we were developing herbicides and pesticides and better seeds and the entire modern agricultural package. In Africa, first of all, there's not a lot of work for people in the cities necessarily, although that's improving. But even more so, if you're smallholder, most of the food that people eat in many nations is actually grown by smallholders. They're growing food. A lot of what we're growing in the United States in our big crop areas is food for animals or parts. It's corn, it's soybean, it's stuff that we use to make something else as opposed to eat it as corn. So by improving the incomes and the productivity of small scale food producers, we are automatically improving their diets and automatically improving diets of and making sure there's enough food for smallholders and for their neighborhood, but also giving them a little bit of extra food on the side that they can sell and then increase their own income. So that's, I think, one of the reasons to really focus in on smallholders is that's where they're in many places, certainly in East Africa, which is where I've spent most of my time. And this is important because food security in Africa is in a rough place. It's been pretty consistently over the last, this is 2014 to 2019. We've had moderate food security insecurity in about, what, 15, 16% of the population, and yet another chunk of people, almost a third total, are in major food insecurity and severe food insecurity. Partly this is because Kenya has a lot of really dry areas, and that plays into it. But the overall poverty rates and hunger rates are consistent, clearly consistent over this time frame. So improving smallholder agriculture, because many Kenyans are smallholder farmers, would increase the overall sustainability and the overall health and wellness of these people. The major crops in Kenya are, these are in Kenya specifically. We've got corn up here in the corner, coffee down here. I think these are flowers up here, and the usual vegetables on the side. These sweet potatoes, this is an old picture. My guess is those are white sweet potatoes. There's been a big push in the last year or two in Kenya and in East Africa in general for more yellow sweet potato, orange sweet potatoes. The carrot kind is what I've seen them described as in Swahili, the carrot kind of sweet potatoes, because of the high levels of beta carotene and more vitamins in them. And you can see, I just wanted to kind of give you all an overview. This is almost a decade old, but my guess is that if anything, the cut flour has increased. But most of these are kind of classic exports, and they're not really food crops. They're tea flowers to be sent to Europe, coffee and beans. So our big concerns with agriculture in terms of making sure that the resource base is well, and making sure that, well, and trying to improve the agricultural production is going to be in soil and water. This slide, this was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then the soil map itself was developed by the Center it's in French, it's CIAT, Center International Agriculture Tropical, I think, in that order, but French is not one of my languages. And I like this map because it really clearly lays out the description of these soils in ways that we can understand. So all that yellow, for example, it's obvious it's the Sahara, that salt degraded soil. We can look at it and go, okay, that makes sense. The really good soil here are going to be this fuchsia color, are good fertile soils. Some of these riverine and bottomland soils are also going to be good, but they're going to be risky because of floods. And the light blue. So the Carolina blue is riverine and bottomland soils, and this aqua is just actual water, bodies of water. And when I look at this map, and I show this map to my agriculture class, and I say, when you look at this map, what do you think this tells us about how we're going to try to, or what we need to do to try to improve agriculture production? We're going to do double agriculture production or whatever the target was. We really need to crank it out. In the United States, we did this. We had really beautiful soil to begin with, and we did it because we had added good seeds, and we added irrigation, and we added chemicals to it. But Africa, there's not a lot of hot pink there. This is not a continent with really rich soils. It's rich in many things. It's rich in gemstones. It's rich in minerals. It's rich in metals. It's rich in oil. It's rich in timber, and it's rich in biodiversity. It's rich in many things, and people, and in brain power. That East Africa is becoming a major tech center. So is South Africa, but it's not great in soil, and it's not great in water. And so these are two kind of long-term problems that have to be dealt with. And the soil is going to be a serious issue because all the pretty seeds in the world, all the technological biotech, GMO, all the things that we've used in the United States are not going to do well if they don't have a good supporting soil base. The second thing we have to really be careful for and think about or be aware of when we're looking at agriculture in East Africa is that the weather itself it's either wet or it's dry. And these next two pictures are in the same place. So this is a picture in South Turkana in northern Kenya. The South Turkana Ecosystem Project. I love this picture and the next picture. They just kill me every time. This is the dry season. I'm gonna show it to you now. Look, it's the same. Look at this tree right here. Keep an eye on that tree so you can be aware of the fact it's the same picture. It's the same place. These pictures were taken 17 days apart. Let's go back and look at that. 17 days between that and that. East Africa is monsoonal. It's either wet or it's dry. And when it's dry, it's really dry. And this is something that makes growing food very, very difficult. You just don't know if it's going to have, you're going to have the water access when you need the water access. And if you're growing cattle, you have to move to where the water access is or to where the grain is, where the green is. But if you're farming, you just have to wait for and hope that the water gets to you. And this is difficult. There are some big trends in agricultural production. What's going on climatically? It is definitely shifting in East Africa. There are a number of farms, for example, that have stopped growing tea up in the Kenyan highlands because tea requires cooler temperatures and a significant amount of rain, and the temperatures have been too warm to keep the tea plants alive. So we see a shift out of cash crops that brought income into the region, and people growing more maize, growing more corn, which at least makes sure that they're increasing their food supply, but it doesn't take care of school fees, for example, because the education system is not fully paid for via taxes. Other debates are these kind of large, can we do it on smallholder farms, or do we need to consolidate and go big the way we did in the United States? And simultaneously, farm size per capita is decreasing because there's only so much land available. And there have been a lot of land grabs. So there's a lot of tenure concerns, whether or not you can maintain and keep and hold on to your land in the face of international pressure from international companies to take over land and grow cash crops. Palm oil is a big one. I don't like this slide. I don't know why it's still there. Most of the ways that people are plowing are, a lot of the traditional agriculture is pretty basic. It's not what we tend to think, but you can increase production even if you're plowing with cattle and donkey, like these guys are. These are, again, Maasai from Tanzania. 20 years before that, this picture was taken in like 2003. 10 years before that, nobody was planting with cattle. And so they're really changing the way that they're producing food as the milk goes down. So we're making this kind of thinking about it in terms of Maasai again. As the number of cattle that they have per person decreases, then they're having to use new techniques. And in this case, it means growing maize, but it means growing maize in places that aren't necessarily great for growing maize. To grow corn, you need 600 millimeters of rain at a minimum in this region for the kind of animals that they have, the kind of crops, the kind of specific varieties of corn that they're breeding and growing. The less rainfall you get a year, the more variable when and where that rainfall falls is. And this can be a huge problem. If you have an average rainfall of 600 milliliters of rain, you need all of those 600 milliliters to land on your field. You can't have them land down the way. If you're a pastoralist, it's fine. You can just walk your animals over there and you'll be cool. If you you can't move your farm. So they're kind of stuck with this as these farm sizes are decreasing and they're trying to grow more corn to make up for the fact. Historically, Maasai also used a lot of land that is now, and permanent water sources that is now considered to be national parks. So they've lost a lot of land grabs. They view it as a land grab. They've lost a lot of land to international conservation pressure and the joy for, Westerners to show up and go chase wildebeest and zebra through the bush. And that's part of the pressure that they have on their ecosystems and on their agro-ecosystems. So in terms of being a smallholder agriculturalist, beyond those kind of wider trends, we have new kinds of constraints. Yeah, so confused. New kinds of constraints, but between how much land you have, whether you diversify, what you can grow. So urban areas coming out and impacting your land, either by coming in and grabbing it, by coming in and cutting down trees and turning those trees into charcoal to run energy and to run fire and cook stoves in the cities. We see land degradation, soil degradation, and nobody has any money. And that becomes a problem if you're going to start doing something like plowing with a tractor, which could really increase the amount of land that you're able to plow at a time and decrease the impact on your livestock, which is a huge thing to your average Maasai. This picture right here, by the way, that was my house as a Peace Corps volunteer. This window is my house. So we're growing in the dry season, we're growing pigeon peas right here, right in the front yard. On campus, that we have Stacy and I were talking about this before y'all showed up. On campus, we have a big edible landscape project. And so we're trying to plant more gardens on campus itself. The hedges in front of my building are rosemary plants, for example. And the kinds of trees that are being planted around campus include many fig trees and blueberry bushes and persimmon trees. So we're trying to increase the amount of edible food on our landscapes here at UNC. In Africa, they've been doing edible landscaping for a long time. So this is the dry season pigeon pea, but in the wet season, the peas got planted together with maize, and the maize got harvested and the pigeon peas kept growing, and eventually we ate pigeon peas. There is a lot of water around. There's a lot of aquifers around, but having access to the water is a problem. I think it's all I really want to say, other than the fact that if you've got lots of water here in the Sahara, but can you imagine what it would take to get a hold of that water? There's a lot of sand. You're out in the middle of nowhere. I thought I'd put this slide somewhere else, but I didn't. But there's a lot of water right there that it's really difficult to get to. Namibia and Angola are pretty excited about all that water though, and that will increase the amount of irrigated land. But if you're in East Africa, there's just not a lot of groundwater available, not a lot of aquifers that we can tap to be able to increase their agricultural production from a water side. So they need to do something that's going to improve their water side from their agricultural production in terms of soil. In terms of water, they have to do something with the water that's in the atmosphere and do more to trap the water that is landing on their farm via rain. So we're going to talk about that in a little while. I did want to mention a few strategies that people have used some of which I've mentioned, using irrigation and growing horticultural crops. These are value-added crops that they can get more money for than they can purchase food, to diversify their farm enterprises, to use improved seeds and pesticides, to weed better. And there's some crop-related things that make sense. But a big strategy is, just like it would be in the United States, to search for off-farm employment. Is there a goal of trying to increase the amount of food that they're able to produce to reach that development goal? All right, the second one is clean water and sanitation. Our targets are every bit as big as the last one. trying to make sure that we have universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water, access to adequate and equitable hygiene for all, and to end open defecation, to improve water quality by decreasing pollution, increase water use efficiency, doing whatever we can to try to get more crop per drop, but more everything per drop, while also protecting water ecosystems. This one we have a better chance of hitting. So worldwide, a third of us don't have access to safe drinking water, but that's better than it was. We still, however, have 2/5 of people with no hand washing facilities, and only 39% of global population has an access to a safely managed sanitation device, which is, a toilet. Only 39% of us are managing to have a toilet or a latrine that is well made and doesn't pollute the environment and thus make them sick again. This is a problem, and this is a problem that's a lot harder to deal with. Most of the areas that I've lived in East Africa have not had running water. I've had latrines, and I have a picture of a latrine I can show you in a few, but I've not had access to running water. And in some areas like Masaini, people are really limited in their water access to literally cupping it up from puddles with a cup and collecting it this way. I've had people yell at me for driving through a mud puddle because it caused the mud to kick up and get into the water, and then the animals would be able to, when they were drinking from that water, the animals would be drinking mud as well and getting into their system, and messing with their health, as well as the mamas going, well, we need this water too, can we keep it clean? Or when the dog would run through it. So this is going to be harder for us to handle. We've made some big strides in giving access to fresh water, but we're having a much harder time with sanitation, and we're still falling short on water. And this is one of those things where there's a lot of variability around the world in terms of fresh water availability and who has it and who doesn't. I love this map. The size of the country is relative to the amount of water that's available, of fresh water that's available. And as you notice, Africa, West Africa is doing pretty good, but there's not, rest of it, not so much. Madagascar looks like the size it's supposed to on a map, this size, but there's just not a lot of free water available. This impacts our health, and it impacts nutrition as well. So if one of the goals for decreasing hunger was about malnutrition, that's not being solved here. And so diarrhea itself, just diarrhea due to having contaminated water sources, is one of the leading causes of childhood mortality worldwide. And as a side thing in here as well, if your hands are dirty, there's some really interesting studies that coming out of Southern Africa that hygiene plays a huge part in malnutrition, as well as in making sure that you don't have diarrhea. Hygiene, in that if there's too much dust in the air, if you've got dust all over your hands and your hands can't be kept clean, one of the things that happens for children is they ingest lots of dirt, which we all know. We've been children and we've watched our children eat lots of dirt. But if you get too much dirt, if it's kind of a constant thing, it can build up in the cilia in your digestive tract. And so your body actually doesn't remove all of the nutrients that it should be able to get from your food. So it's a double whammy. You're getting triple whammy. You're getting fewer calories you already have a limited number of calories that we're getting anyway. On top of that, you're not pulling as many of them out because you've got so much dirt in your intestines, so you're not being as efficient with those calories and with the nutrients that you're bringing in, and you're running the risk of contaminating yourself and getting various Oregon Trail style diseases. And these are Oregon Trail diseases. Hygiene in and of itself, getting people access to clean water and soap so that they can wash their hands, could make a huge strides. In terms of sanitation devices, I did want to show you a picture of Maicho. This was Cho was Swahili for latrine. This was mine. It's made of corrugated iron on the outside. It has a cement floor, and really, I just washed this. It's not gross, but it is just literally a hole in the ground. I actually kind of liked my Cho. I was the only person who'd ever used it, and so it was really clean and empty, but there was the day the kitten fell down it, and that was a problem. We did get the kitten out, but it's a thing that people worry about, is things falling down latrines. Just this is an improved latrine, an improved sanitation device, and yet 39% of the world have access to this or better. There's been a big push in Kenya, this is several years old, to try to increase the amount of sanitation access. We're not there yet. All right, I've been babbling now for half an hour straight. So what kind of options do we have to get out of this? What kind of solutions can we see looking at water and food together? One of the big win-wins from the agricultural production side is to have better soil techniques. So in this picture, we can see this is a farm. We've got some banana trees right here. This is a papaya tree right here. There's more bananas back there. There were oranges on this farm as well. I think this is an orange tree right here. These are Grevillea robusta. They're used for scaffolding and for building timber. What we can see in here as diversification is our first thing that we can see, which isn't fully a soil technique, but it's certainly one of the possibilities that farmers use to be able to survive and make it. Actually, I think this is a baby orange tree right here. There's one right there too. The other thing that we're seeing right here is some soil techniques. So we see trenches and berms that are going down this hill. And what that is doing is it's collecting water. Water is collecting down in here so that the bananas, which need a little bit more water, this is a pretty dry area as well, they can collect in that space and they hold on to it. Additionally, any soil that's going along down the side of that hill is also being collected and trapped. So we're not losing nutrients, we're not losing what little topsoil we have access to. So better soil techniques are win-win-win. The better quality our soil is, the more organic material in our soil, the better our soil structure, and the more water it can hold. If we can set up terraces or plow against the grain, which is something we see frequently in the United States, it's also kind of falling out of favor a little bit, although not from the soil scientist perspective, is if you can plow around the side of a slope across the grain, when the water goes down the hill, it's collecting soil along the way, and you can also then you can stop it. Having the rills and the ridges of your plowing will help collect that water and keep it from going all the way down the mountain. So better soil techniques are going to be huge, certainly in a place like Africa, which has really old degraded soils, where soil quality is poor. The more soil more organic matter we put in the soil, the more water it can hold, the more nutrients that are available to it. I really dig soil, so I could talk about it a while. I think soil is really cool. Another possibility that you could think about are different kinds of water conservation methods. And I put this link here, and I'm hoping it's going to go for me. And it's not going to. I'm going to fix this link. I was just looking at it, so. And I think this would be kind of fun to show with children if I can find it again. I've used it with my students and now I can't find it. Dang it. I will find it and show you at some later point in time. I was looking at food pictures too. 35 water conservation methods. I don't know why it's not showing up, but I found it just a few minutes ago. It is a list of really small scale techniques that, kind of like I was just talking about, the berms, the fanya jews, the trenches, zai pits, which are used in West Africa, and are really interesting ways of going down the hills and planting one corn plant in a little basin to be able to collect water coming down as it goes down the hill. Collect tiny bits of water. The more water you can collect, the better off you are. But also small scale irrigation, and also double digging, and also things to do that you have too much water. What do you do then? So there's lots of these kind of really low tech ways. And once I fix that link, I will, I will send it to you because it's super awesome. Another win could be reducing post-harvest losses on the other side. So we could be improving the soil to help with water. We could be helping add water to the soil in better ways. But if we could also figure out better ways to reduce soil losses. So if we're losing 20 to 25%, I think is that color, of our post-harvest weight percent, because it's being eaten by insects or mice or whatever, reducing that food waste is going to be really huge. Food waste in general, we lose 30% around the world of the amount of food that we produce. In the States, we lose 30% of the food after it's purchased and lands in our house for the most part. Some of it's at the grocery store. A lot of times it's what we bought and we forgot to eat, or just couldn't bear the thought of cooking that night, as I'm sure most of us have been there. If you're in East Africa, most of it gets lost in the field or in transport. I actually don't want to talk about this next one, so we're going to skip it. Some things that I think would be kind of cool to use, and I'm guessing this is probably older students, and you've got a lot of smaller students, it looked like, younger students in this room, or teachers of younger students in this room. The Family Early Warning Systems Network, on the far side of paying attention to famines and trying to reduce them and trying to stop. If the sooner you can get food to a country that looks like it is feeling precarious in terms of its food security, the sooner you can head off a famine. And so USAID is a part of this Famine Early Warning System Network, and they're using, they're monitoring for a lot of different ways. Part of what they're using is geographic information systems to look at satellite data, to see how green, first of all, the NDVI, the normalized digitized vegetation index, to see how green essentially the landscape is, meaning how much rain, how well are the plants doing, as well as bringing in social data to look for civil unrest, to see what's going on in the economy, to try to predict where famines may occur. So this is on the painful side, right? So this is on the famine side. They're not looking at all the countries. They are looking at several in Central America as well, for those of you who are Spanish teachers. But we can see right now that the Horn of Africa is someplace that earlier this fall, there was a significant amount of concern about. And once you click through, if you're on the actual website, when you click through, you can see where the problems seem to be and why, and they'll describe it. And I think it's really handy that way. On the flip side, thinking about development and thinking about making it better, there is this wonderful TV show called Shamba Shape Up. And Shamba Shape Up is this old house for farms. Shamba is a Swahili word for farm. And it's a reality TV show, and these two incredibly enthusiastic and excessively happy people walk around people's farms in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, mostly in Kenya, but also in Tanzania and Uganda, and talk about how you can make those farms better. And I love them. They're in Swahili and in English. They're more fun in Swahili, but most of us don't speak Swahili. That's my own particular weirdness. And yeah, thanks, Stacy, for putting that there. And it's just delightful. And so I highly recommend going through and taking a look at them. I have sent students on like binge watching Shamba Shape Ups in the past because they're extraordinary. But one of the amazing things in the new Shamba Shape Ups, let me see if I can get it to work, is that they're also these days, they've got all these clips and they break it down. So in the episode 1 of this season, this is season 2. Yeah, this is series 11. was actually in an area that I was a Peace Corps volunteer. Can you see this? Did it show up for you guys? Okay, let me see if I can new share. Here we go. So it's the Shamba Shape Up. They're doing soil testing and intercropping and dairy cows and solar power irrigation systems. And the nice thing about these is they're describing them and walking around the farm so people can see what these farms look like. They can see how people are actually living and trying to make their lives better. I love them because, I mean, I'm at UNC, I'm teaching lots of city kids and suburban kids, and they've never been on a farm. Every time I show a picture of corn, you know, 98% of the class is just like, wow, that's tall. And, and it's getting better. It's been better in the last decade than it was when I started teaching these. But whenever I can get them to actually, I make them go walk, I make them go visit farms whenever possible. In fact, I used to actually take them to farms. Did not happen this year due to COVID. But I want them to see it. And this is a way that they can actually see what's going on. One of the crazy things in this series, though, is the sweet potatoes that I mentioned to you earlier. And I was trying to see if anybody, if they have it in these pictures. They don't. They're really on solar power right now, which when I lived in Africa, when I lived in Kenya, when I first went in 1993, 1994, 7.5% of Kenyans had access to electricity. Really not that many. When I was, right now, Kenya claims that 70% of their population has access to electricity, which is an extraordinarily huge change. I'm gonna go back to the slideshow right here. But one of the things that I think is really amusing in this new series of Shamba Shape Up is not only are they talking about sweet potatoes all the time, which as a transplanted and now new North Carolinian, well, it's been a couple of decades now, but as a North Carolinian, I am all here for some sweet potatoes because we are the #1 producer of sweet potatoes in the country, although not the world because China's got us beat. So I love to see some sweet potatoes, and they're doing weird things with sweet potatoes. They're in Kenya, they're turning sweet potatoes into sweet potato flour and making sweet potato bread that way and using the starch in all kinds of different ways that I've never thought of. But also they are, they're pushing Instant Pots. And I was floored by this when I saw this. And then because I was thinking about it as a person who's only 7.4% of the people I ever came across had electricity. But if 70% of people have access to electricity, an Instant Pot is definitely going to be a way to reduce air quality issues from particulate matter because people are literally, you know, cooking on a campfire all the time inside houses, and it's going to cook it quicker. So I was super amused to see that, the Instant Pot is trying to take over Kenya. It amuses me to no end. So I cannot talk about how awesome this show is enough. And I think that's all I have off the top of my head. I would like to, let's look at this nice picture of these guys at night setting up there. This is in Kenya a long time ago because they're setting it up. They're light in a taa. They're using a hurricane lamp. So with this nice evening shot, let me stop and ask you if you have any questions, because I have now talked more than necessary. Wow, this is just like being last year, teaching online, me in a bunch of boxes. This is why I never knew who any of my students looked like from last year.
I'm curious about reforestation. You read about that, but I don't know if that's really a viable option.
So Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, I forget what year it was, a decade or so ago, just before I went to Africa at the first time, which is where I went to Kenya the first time, was starting this big tree planting campaign in East Africa. And I was actually an agroforester as a Peace Corps volunteer, so I was planting trees on farms mostly because it was so dry. I was planting fruit trees because people wanted, if they were going to plant a tree, it better be a useful tree. My now husband was a Peace Corps volunteer in some very, very wet mountains in the Tidy Hills, and he did a lot of tree planting there. So tree planting is going on and is ongoing, especially in a country where a lot of trees are being used for charcoal. Tree planting is definitely going on. They're working on greening the Sahara when you look into West Africa and Northwest Africa. But you really have to kind of work on it at first to get the water where you need it to be. So there's a lot of reforestation. I had more luck with planting food crops, again, edible landscapes. Apparently I've been doing that for 20 years, 25 years, but it's a slow process. But yes, it's happening. On a sustainability thing, what was our topic supposed to be? It was land, it was food, water, and sustainability, right? Originally. Oh, you're curious about solar power is huge right now. Now, this has been a big change. Oh, here I saw it, but in pirating. Oh, interesting question, Michelle. And I don't know that I have an answer to that, although I do remember seeing pirating happening. I don't have any data at the tips of my fingers for that, and I will try to make a note. Due to pirating. Also, nice use of the verb. I would think that most of the food that I saw that didn't make it because of spoilage and transit. That was by far the biggest problem. I mean, the roads were really bad. I think, yeah, most of it was, I mean, I've taken a lot of bus trips and just been handed a basket of tomatoes, or somebody would have their feet under the on top of the basket of tomatoes because they were trying to cram all this vegetation into one space. But food does get stolen, just the way you hear about, you know, pistachios, people stealing pistachios in the United States because they're worth a lot of money. Or what was the crazy one? A couple of years ago, they had a maple sugar heist. God, I love that, up in Canada. So it happens, but I don't know that it happens more so than the spoilage. The solar power and wind power, I haven't seen a lot of wind power, but solar power is huge. And a lot of those Shamba shape-ups are actually talking about adding solar panels to people's houses right now. So it's a way to leapfrog over the technology and the infrastructure needs, or especially the infrastructure needs of traditional energy sources. In East Africa, at least, there's a lot of solar power due to that. So you're trying to approach the energy problem in a bunch of different ways. On the one side, you're approaching it by fuel conserving cook stoves and instant pots and trying to reduce your your energy needs. Sorry, soil. I talk about it all the time. Your energy needs. On the other side, they're trying to just increase the amount that they have available to them. And I used to have a slide in this slideshow, and I took it out because it was a couple years old, that showed all the different kinds of energy that was being used in Kenya about a decade ago. In their push, like, it's all hands on deck, right? Whatever we can use to get energy out there. They're using a lot of water power. There's a lot of hydropower coming out of, they've got dams on a bunch of different rivers. There's a lot of geothermal because it's a very active volcanic region. The Rift Valley is still in the process of moving, so there's several volcanoes around for geothermal energy, which I think is really cool. The hydropower has been a lot more problematic. Big dam projects tend to be development boondoggles in lesser developed countries. There's a lot of money pouring in, and people want to put them in places where they aren't going to be able to ever have the capacity that you think they're going to have. There are programs in place to help pay for solar power development. I think a lot of that is probably NGO money. Most of these countries, they're poor countries. And when you have poor countries with limited budgets and huge needs, it's really hard to figure out what you fund first. But certainly one of the global goals, actually, to swing back around to the early sustainable development goals, is clean energy, and making sure people have access to power, because without power, it used to be a hidden goal before in the Millennium Development Goals. They had water, they had food, but they didn't have energy there. But you can't pump water without energy, particularly. They've got a couple of treadle pumps where you can, dance your way through it and get some water up. There's a USAID funded one of my favorite African singers in the early 2000s. He's since passed away, to actually sing a song about these treadle mills that you can dance. That essentially, you're not dancing, you're walking on them. But he had a rap song all about it. It was great. But so there's definitely a bunch of NGO funded projects out there for solar power and solar energy. The taxation rate, most of the taxes in Kenya and Tanzania, there's not a lot of federal funds handed out, because there's not a lot of federal funds taken in. Most of the taxation is through VAT, through value added taxes. There's not income taxes in the same way we have it. I suspect, at least not to my knowledge, and I think it's probably because most of the economy is an informal economy, not a formal economy. Wind power and wind turbines, not as much to my knowledge, although North Africa has quite a few solar farms and wind farms building up, and a lot of that actually is to sell the energy to Europe for their renewable energy portfolio. Are there jobs here in North Carolina related to the study and research in Africa? Probably. I mean, there's definitely people at NC State studying different ways. Well, Kenya is about to become a biotechnology hub. They've got several very strong agricultural research centers, and they've got lots of people who are trained by Americans, trained in American universities in biotechnology. They did 25 years ago too. I remember talking to somebody about various biotechnology and recombinant DNA technology in the mid 1990s, because I had done some molecular biology research as an undergraduate, and I think he was pretty delighted to have someone talk to him about it, because he didn't get to very much then. 30 years later, very much so. So there's a lot of work in Kenya that's being done in this arena by Kenyans. In the United States, NC State's working on a lot of the same things. There's some really interesting push-pull technologies, some integrated pest management projects that are being researched because they were designed in Kenya and can be moved around the world. We've got some of the same weed problems here that they have there. The southern armyworm, I think it's a southern armyworm. There's an armyworm that's pretty pervasive in the American Southeast and in this Central America, which has just arrived in East Africa, which has been a huge problem. And so I know they're doing some research on that there. So the specifics of it I wouldn't know, but my guess is yes. That was Dana's question. Michelle was asking about indigenous food. And I think this is a really interesting question. So when you ask Kenyans and Tanzanians about ugali, again, it's maize meal, maize porridge, and ask them where it came from, and they say, here. But it was taken there at one point to help feed people who were on slave lines. It was definitely a colonial food that did well, and it produces a lot of calories, and so it's taken over. In terms of indigenous crops, there are lots of greens that are eaten. Those yellow, the white yams are indigenous. Sorghum, there's a lot of work on sorghum that is being eaten, a bunch of research on sorghum right now, because it can survive in really dry areas. But certainly Western agronomy, and thus Western science, left behind a lot of the food crops that were eaten in Africa on its own. And people still go and collect them. They're still going and They're still going collecting wild greens. They go and collect wild fruits. But for the most part, science kind of ignored them. And these orphan crops are one of the reasons why their production levels are so low, is that we haven't been paying attention to the crops that they need the work done on. So that's a really good question. And I think that from the materials I'm reading, the push to try to increase that is growing. But even, cattle are the indigenous food of so many Kenyans. I mean, having milk in their diet is a huge part of it. And nobody has made a new medicine for trypanosomiasis, to deal with the tsetse fly. No one's come up with anything new other than giving them chemical dips like a bug spray. No one's come up with anything new for that since the 1950s. It's just not been what people have looked at. And that, American style kisasa cows, in Swahili, kisasa is of the now. So modern cows that produce, gallons of milk a day. Your average East African cow is producing 1 liter, but it doesn't get sick. These American cows would get sick really fast. So they're starting to do some more research on it, but it's been a slow process. Really, until 2008, a lot of agricultural research had stagnated, and there was the food crisis in 2008 after our recession and the global recession. There was a big jump in food prices, partly because of the recession, partly because of some bad weather in Australia, and then partly because everybody's decided to freak out and suddenly not sell food that was in their country. And so the flow of food changed. And that brought people's attention brought back international NGO and research attention back into tropical crops. So hopefully, fingers crossed, they're making some progress there. That would be a cool thing for, who was it? Dana's daughter to go take a look at, is some of these orphan crops, indigenous crops, because I'm sure there's people at NC State talking about it. Yeah, the preservation of indigenous foods and cultures, it's so weird that the concept of indigeneity is really fascinating when you're in Africa, where in the United States, it's pretty clear who's indigenous and who's not. If Native Americans are indigenous, the rest of us are not. If you are in Africa, who is indigenous? Are the Maasai indigenous, but the Kikuyu aren't? Are the hunter-gatherers or the Hadzabe in Tanzania, are they indigenous? If the Hadzabe are indigenous, are the Maasai indigenous? And if they're indigenous, are the Arusha who go to school and dress Western clothing and still are very African? Are they not? I mean, the indigeneity, I think, is a really fascinating concept, and I'm not enough of an anthropologist to talk about it a lot, but it certainly came up in conversation a lot in terms of whose land use gets prioritized and who gets development money and aimed at indigenous Africans, and who, like, what does this mean? And but traditional foods, if you think about it in terms of traditional foods, there definitely are traditional foods that aren't just maize. In fact, even beans there are not usually the same kind of beans we eat. They've got very specific ideas about what a bean should look like. They've got 20 different varieties of them. Yams, cassava. The big ones are going to be sorghum and millet, though. And then a host of small things that I don't think anybody grows. They're pretty much just wild. Yeah, right? Super interesting to think about indigeneity this way. So I was with some Maasai one day in Ngorongoro Crater. I could tell Maasai stories all day. So I was with some Maasai in Ngorongoro Crater, which is this, World Heritage Site. And Maasai in Ngorongoro Crater, they're allowed to live in the park, partly, and this goes back again to the way that we view Africa and Africans as being somehow more indigenous or more something, more like wildlife. I mean, there's some really ridiculous ways that we view East African parks and whether people belong in them or not. So Maasai are allowed to live inside Ngorongoro, but they're not allowed to have too many cows, which means they're all really hungry and they're all a little bit poorer than they should be. Although they can make money off of tourists, that's not necessarily the life that they were going for. And they went to the Indigenous Peoples Conference in Canada, and they were fired up about the Indigenous Peoples Conference when they were in Canada. And the First Nations in Canada set up a blockade, and they blocked off a bunch of highways and to get people to pay attention in Canada to the plight of First Nations. And so these Maasai, these old elders are like, man, we're going to make a blockade. We're going to set it up and none of the tourists are going to be able to get into the national park. And yet when asked about whether are they more indigenous than the people that are living at the base of the mountain who are farmers, it got sticky. Nobody really knows. I think it's such a fascinating question. Anybody else?
We'll probably be able to take about one more question if someone has a question. Amy, this has been a really fascinating talk. I really do appreciate this.
Thank you. Thank you. I will happily talk about Africa to anybody, and also about food and water and sanitation at length. And I was telling Stacy, this is totally off topic, but thinking about things that students should be interested in terms of sustainability. I was telling Stacy before you all came in that I'm teaching a class on sustainable textiles right now. And which is, it's a huge use of resources. And it's also a huge promoter of waste. And one of the largest, if not the largest used clothing market in the world is in Ghana. And a lot of it has been, they get 15 million pieces of secondhand clothes a week from the West. And on average, we wear an item of clothing for like 7 times. And it gets counted as, they claim it as being recycled. The big textile recyclers say, oh, it's being recycled. We're sending it to Ghana. And the Ghanaians don't want our old crummy Forever 21 and Old Navy t-shirts. They don't want our old leggings. This is not their style. And a lot of it ends up trashed and either burning and polluting the atmosphere or in streams, blocking things. It's just the amount of waste is really incredible. And as Christmas is coming up, and my friends have started asking me, so have you heard about this Shein and all these really cheap internet and Instagram associated online stores that are selling things for cheaper than they can even be produced? I don't even understand how fast fashion can manage this. Micro fast fashion can even manage it. Thinking about the dump there and the situation in Ghana as it relates to our used textiles, as we push our waste problem off in Africa, I would totally go there. It's just so close to home. The governments actually have stopped them in some places from coming in, but then remember when, I don't know how many of you are my age, but do y'all remember or ever heard of it, that barge that went up and down the East Coast of New York trash back in the 80s because they didn't have any, like nobody would take it in. So what do we do with it other than that? And there's a lot of money being made in crud. The entire supply chain is a real mess. And let me recommend this book that I'm super excited about. It's called, I've been telling everybody about it because most books about clothing are really boring. And this one is super well done. It's called Unraveled. And the author is Maxine Bedat, B-E with a thingy on top, D-A-T. And she's an American lawyer who's did a really good job following a pair of jeans, is how she calls it. Really top notch. And it'll make you furious, but well written and still make you furious. And it's got a great chapter on the Cantamanto, I think is the name of the used clothing store, used clothing market. It's acres of clothing. That's what I think. Yeah, I would start in with food, and then I would start in with fashion, because those are big emotional decisions that we all have, and that's why I like to talk about them and from an environmental perspective. So if you do, let me know. If you make them watch Shamba Shape Up, I'd be excited to know if anybody likes them as much as some of my students do. They laugh at me every time I show them. They're like, really? And I'm like, yep, you're watching this. It's great. And then they'll watch like 5 on their own because it's entertaining.
Well, wow. Thank you again, Amy. I'm gonna hit the stop record.